So, as Richard said, my name is Dan Hughes. I'm Director of Data and Information Products at RICS. I'm also leading the piece of work looking at the Proptech strategy and what do we do about that. So what I'd like to do is just give a very high-level overview of some of the things that we're seeing, and perhaps as context to the discussion, look at it from a few different angles. So perhaps how it's changing job roles, how it's going to change buildings and how we use them, and also some of the implications of things like data. So before we start, I just want to start by mentioning what is Proptech. It's a term that's used very widely and it's being used an awful lot at the moment. And really Proptech is just, to state the obvious, coming together the words of technology and property. They're coming together and they're really just representing the change that's happening in the property sector at the moment, which is that technology is enabling or driving some of the things that are changing. So technology isn't a new thing, it's been in the industry for a long time, and Proptech is really just representing that shift that's going on. And if we start by looking at job roles, then we can see that this is perhaps how job roles would have been done in the past. And you'll excuse the fairly simplistic models here, but if you take something like a valuer, then in the past, you'd have produced some form of report. So your role would have been to go out and collect data. You'd have used things, it could have been in your own head or pad and paper. You could have used a computer, you'd have produced a report, and you'd have then sent that on to your clients. And what's happening more and more is the data collection is starting to go through technology. So actually that part of the role is being automated. And what's going to happen, and to a degree has started happening, is that people are now starting to advise on what's happening, but the reports themselves are going from one computer to the other. So one of the questions I'm asked an awful lot, and we'll come back to this later, I'm sure in the panel discussion, is does this mean we're all out of jobs? Personal view is not at all. I think what's going to happen is that the job roles are going to change. So some things are going to be automated, and the role that we have is going to be changing and advising on things. So to try and understand how that's going to change, we can start splitting down the roles of jobs as we go. So again, it's a crude model, but if we look at job roles consisting of collecting data, we then analyze data, we then put it in some form so we can consume it, or the clients can consume it, and then overlaying all of this, which I put at the top, is some form of human judgment. The human interaction, the advice, the gut feeling, whatever it might be. And we can see in the middle column here some of the examples of what we would have used in the past, or potentially today, to produce things. So collecting data would have been a tape measure, it would have been a camera. Analysing data would have been done in people's heads, or you might use a pen and paper, you might use a calculator or something similar, and then we put it into a form so people can consume that information and that judgment. So that could be a report, it could be a map, or it could be a floor plan. And then at the top, you've got the human judgment element to it. And this provides a useful framework for us to look at a lot of the buzzwords and the technologies that are out there, looking at how it's going to impact roles going forward. So for example, looking at things like drones and mobile phones, whilst they do a number of different things, these are critically important for collecting data. Internet of Things is something that's talked about a lot. There is a huge volume of data that's being collected all the time and being created on a live basis. That causes us a problem because we can't make sense of it. There's so much data. And so this is really where we get into machine learning, big data, artificial intelligence, which is really needed to make sense of all of the data that's being created underneath. You've then got the consumption, and this is where we get into things like augmented reality and virtual reality, and to a degree interactive screens. And if we look at the top, we've still got the human judgment. So whilst it might be advising on slightly different things, I still think that interaction and that judgment and that advice is going to be needed in the future. And we can start using this as a model to understand how it's going to impact our roles in the future. If you just sit there and think about your role, I'm sure there's a lot more involved than this. But if you do split it into these areas, the bottom two blocks are really where technology is pretty good. So this is where data collection, data analysis is where technology is going to automate roles, it's going to take elements of tasks out of people's roles. If you look at the consumption, technology is good there as well, but actually this isn't about replacing things, this is about enhancing customer experience. So at the moment you might go on a website and look at a photograph of a building, in the future you might look at a virtual reality model. You're doing the same thing, it's about communicating, but you are enhancing the customer experience. And then, in my opinion, the human judgment element, whilst it will change the topic that you're advising on, isn't actually going to change a great deal in terms of quantity. So what we can start doing is splitting this down even further to try and apply it to surveying sector. And RICS have done a piece of research which does exactly that, and it splits it into around 45 different tasks. And it starts looking at how the automation of each one of those tasks. This is a much more complicated version of the diagram before. And you can see on the screen there are two colours there. So the blue is what is estimated could already be automated by today's technology. These are the tasks. And the red is what's going to happen within 10 years' time. If you look at that, for some people that's quite scary because their roles are made up of a lot of those tasks. For other people, especially where there's more of a human skill, then actually it's going to have much less of an impact. And I think that this starts relating to timing. And it's a big question about when PropTech's going to happen. And the answer is we've been using technology for many, many years. Technology isn't a new thing. From my perspective, this is very much about an evolution rather than a revolution. And I think that technology is something that has been around and used in the property sector better than some people claim for many years. And I'm not a big fan of slides with text on, but if you'll forgive me this one slide, I do want to just read this out. And this says that computers can and must revolutionise a state agency. Valuation surveyors have tended to say that properties can never be marketed like other commodities because they're so diverse, precise comparisons cannot be made. But a computer can deal with these problems quite simply just as soon as all the possible variables have been broken down into code. The valuer will still be needed to interpret the vast amount of data, and the computer can assemble. So I don't think this will be a huge surprise to anyone, but I just wanted to throw it out to the audience. For anyone who doesn't follow me on Twitter, any guesses about when this was made, when this statement was made? 1980? Okay, so I'll give you a clue. So Frank Sinatra was the top-selling album, and we won the World Cup. So this is something written in the Charter Surveyor in 1966. So technology and the ability to look at how it's going to change things is not a new thing, and it's been up for a long time. What is definitely happening is that technology is getting faster. So the rate of change is happening faster. And from my perspective, this is where the industry is starting to shift. And so some of the slightly more science fiction type applications of technology are starting to happen now as well. So I'm not going to go through all of these, but you have blockchain, autonomous vehicles, virtual reality. One of my favorites is on the top left-hand side. I think you probably agree, not the most beautiful building in the world. But this is a 57-story mixed-use building, primarily it's offices. It's based in China, and this was built in 19 days using off-site technology primarily. So 19 days to build a 57-story is starting to change things. These are all examples of the early side of adoption. So clearly these are quite new. However, they are all starting to happen in the real world. So that's a quick look at how it might impact jobs. And let's have a look at when it's going to happen and the speed of it. The truth is, it's rare that one single technology is likely to impact things. What's going to happen is it's going to be a number of these different things working as an ecosystem. And what we can start doing is look a little bit into the future about some of the changes. And a lot of our panelists in particular have some expertise on these areas, so I'll go through these quite quickly. But if you look at things like how technology is changing assets, if you look at offices, co-working space is something that's happening, it's well documented, and there's a lot of discussion about that. But if we go back to how technology is changing job roles, it's replacing a lot of the things that we need to sit at a desk and type away for. But the human interaction bit is going to be increasingly important. So for offices, it's going to be much more about customer service. It's going to be about servicing the people rather than just producing a product. It's going to be about making sure there's good connectivity, there's a nice environment to be productive in, and lots of space for us to interact in. There's another example on the top right here, which is a car park. Now, car parks aren't always the most exciting assets to bring up here. However, this is a clever car park which is using technology in a lot of different ways. So this is based in Hollywood. It's a 60-space car park that was knocked down and rebuilt using technology to improve it to a 200 space. Effectively, you can drive into the front, it will park the car for you, and then you can leave. And that's quite clever because it's improved, reduced costs and improved income. What's also done is it started building and being designed for autonomous vehicles. So it's got the obsolescence of normal vehicles, so it can start taking autonomous vehicles, they can park themselves and they can be charged. And actually, even cleverer than that, it's gone the stage before where we don't necessarily need to have cars, we'll just have them on demand, and it's already been designed so it can be converted to residential and offices. So one of the questions I get asked a lot is, should we buy car parks, which is a question I completely duck. However, I think there's a good way where you can start looking at assets and how they're going to change over time because of technology, and start putting some sort of design into to mitigate some of the challenges. Bottom left looks like a supermarket. Actually, this is not. This is a dark store. So this is set up purely for internet sales. So it's a supermarket in most different ways, apart from it's not open to the public. And this starts raising questions about, is this industrial or is this retail? And so our traditional ways of looking at asset classes may change over time. And there's also, just at the bottom, this is around speed, and we've already seen some examples of this. These are actually 3D printed buildings in China. They can do 10 a day. And so we're starting to look at how is the speed of construction, which is traditionally pretty slow in the industry, how is that going to impact buildings going forward? And then just one last consideration just before we get into the panel discussion. So it's quite a well-trodden cliche that we work in silos. So the industry works typically in silos of what we do. And we will start off by having planning, land surveying, it will go through to construction, all the way to operation, where you have a number of different skills. And people will tend to work on their own. And underneath each one of those disciplines, you'll have some form of collection of data. Now, whether people share data well in those silos is probably a topic for another day. But at the moment, we do tend to keep data, and then we do not pass it on to the next stage. Whilst there is some blurring of the silos at the top, what is definitely starting to happen is that data is flowing more and more through the building. For anyone who's heard of BIM, which is Building Information Modeling, this is a huge part of the driver behind this. It's about getting data right from the start to go through the whole life cycle. So this presents us with a couple of opportunities, but problems as well. So not only are buildings starting to create more and more data on a daily basis, they are also starting to have more and more data coming from the history. So as a valuer in 20 years' time, you'll be using data that's created at the construction phase and the planning phase today. So you won't meet the people who are doing it, but you will be using that data. And that then has a knock-on effect to skills. So we're going to not necessarily understand how to create or analyze the data, because technology will do that. What we are going to have to do is understand the implications of that data and how it's going to be interpreted. So I hope that gives you a quick overview of how technology is changing property from a few different angles. Thank you very much for listening, and if you've got any questions, please shout on the panel discussion.